afternoon, good evening. Good to see you all. All right. Hope everybody's doing well today. All right. So we're just at the top of the hour. I'll go ahead and call up our slide for today. Okay, that should do it. Okay, so as always, Benum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you and welcome you back. It's good to see you all. A brief opening prayer this morning. Oh God, make me to let go of my nets. Help me to fish for people, bearing nothing but the infinite ocean of your mercy. Amen. So our first reading spans 167, if you're following in the book. We begin. But such spiritual anxiety rooted in an us and them mentality is nothing new. These are precisely the kinds of fear-based boundaries that Jesus' ministry transgressed in his own day. So too, amid advances and setbacks, the vocation of the contemplative is rooted in an interior commitment to an increasing expansion of their own consciousness in ever greater fidelity to the gospel call to love. The other side of holy transgression is solidarity with those whom our boundaries of judgment, fear, and condemnation have excluded or set apart. Luke's version of the call of the first disciples elucidates this point perhaps better than any other. Jesus instructed Peter to put his nets out to sea, even after having been unsuccessful all day. As a result, he caught so many fish, his nets began to tear. At first, Peter and his companions, fearful and awestruck, begged Jesus to leave them alone. But instead, he reassured them with a promise to make them fishers of people. With that, they brought their boats to shore and left everything and followed him. So there's wisdom here. No matter how broad or wide our net, no matter how far it is cast or how abundant the catch, a net is still a net, and the fish beyond its reach remain infinitely more abundant than those that lie within. As the nets of our exclusion begin to tear under the expanding consciousness of God as ground of our being, we begin to touch on the transgressive nature of Jesus' own ministry. With Christ, we are compelled to tear down any boundary that threatens to separate anyone from the ocean of God's love. If the contemplative is to become a disciple of Christ, it is not enough that we merely widen our nets. We must abandon them altogether. Amen. So our second reading spans from the end of 167 to 68 for those following in the book. The transgressive nature of Christian holiness and contemplative discipleship is patterned in the incarnation itself. As we saw in chapter 2, the original transgression of Adam and Eve has been ameliorated by the unthinkable scandal of the Word made flesh, that divine transgression of the very boundaries between heaven and earth, divinity and humanity, life and death. This is the great reversal of human sinfulness by divine love, of human arrogance by divine humility, and of human disobedience by the divine obedience of Christ. This great reversal is expressed in the overall structure of Mark's gospel, which frames, perhaps better than any other, the public ministry of Jesus as an act of divine transgression. Two parallel events, which serve as literary bookends, herald the first and last moments of Jesus' public ministry, at his baptism and again at his death. Mark describes the Spirit of God having been unleashed into the world through a divine act of tearing. The unmistakable repetition of Mark's reference to the tearing of the heavens in 1:10 and the tearing of the temple veil in 15:38 provides a linguistic thread that inextricably links these two moments in the gospel. It is an unexpected, indeed almost violent image by which Mark describes the inbreaking of God into the world. Having transgressed the boundaries between heaven and earth, the sacred and the profane, holiness can never again be set apart from a world now penetrated by the glory of God. Our closing prayer. O God, make me to see the boundaries that divide my very heart, that I may better see the divisions of which I am a part. Amen. And that was not intended to rhyme, but it did, so I let it go. Okay. All right. So, welcome back. And as always, I open the floor to a time of quiet and reflection or conversation as thoughts or questions or comments arise. So you have the floor.
Could I ask you to show that first reading, please? Thank you. Just in one more minute. Thank you.
Sorry, Peggy. Very quickly, did I land on the place you wanted me to be?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much, Father.
Okay, you're welcome. Christine, please. And you're muted, Christine. Sorry.
This is such a beautiful, beautiful passage. I was really moved to tears because the idea of not having to have our nets at all speaks to how God fills the whole universe. And so the way forward for me is to simply realize that everyone has been redeemed. Even the worst sinner has already been redeemed. And all I have to do is visualize that, to put energy behind that, to realize that as a fact, and hope that that would influence the person and soften the edges around that person, that they might come to know the height, the width, the length, and the depth of the love of Christ, that they might be filled with all the glory of God. And that feels so freeing to me. I just rejoice in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, that's a very beautiful reflection on that. I recall writing this section and really finding that image of, which is consistent throughout the Gospels, of dropping nets, not broadening them to really become just a place where I was able to break through a little bit into the implications of that, particularly out of a context of contemplative discipleship, which is what I'm trying to explore. So thank you for picking up on that and seeing that. That's nice. Let's see. Peter, please.
Good morning. So I was wondering if what you meant by it, or if I'm reading this right, in the final prayer, it seems to reflect the tearing of the curtain and all that. The boundaries and divisions is like I think the final prayer said something to know the division or the boundaries of his love. Is that meant to be of what? What did you say? I
I
can't
think
remember.
I'm looking for it now. I don't know where it disappeared on my desk. Yeah. So the idea is that I see it here. So it was to look at the boundaries ultimately that divide my own heart, that I may better see the divisions that I'm a part of, essentially.
So the divisions that I'm a part of, what that sort of says for me is a common theme that I find on my spiritual path is it's through my brokenness that I am open to his grace. And is that sort of fit with what you're saying there? And that fits with the tearing of the veil, like, the brokenness, the kind of the violence of it. It's not necessarily a healy-feely kind of experience. It's more of a rah.
Yeah, there's definitely. So I think what I had in mind is the way that those curtains tended to, because there were two curtains essentially that separated various portions, and then beyond those curtains there were actual boundaries, walls that separated other courts, in which the court of the Gentiles, the court of women, men, and then priests. And the closer you get to that inner sanctum of the Holy of Holies, which a very select few people were allowed in. So I was thinking about the divisions of the temple, whether they be by curtains or walls, are like the divisions of within my own heart that already have prejudices, show favoritism, biases, and how that those divisions actually, to kind of, to your point, tear through them to some degree, to open them, because those divisions within my heart are where the divisions in society, those seeds begin. Right. So where all of the problems we have in society begin with those very divisions I hold in my own heart. You're in, you're out, you're the other, right? You're part of my tribe and you're not. So all those places that I create interior divisions become the seeds for social division, is what I was trying to suggest there. So to start with my own breaking those down. Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Thanks.
You're welcome. Lucy, please. Good morning.
Good morning. I couldn't help but think of transgression related to euthanasia. And I would like you to help me to discern, because last Sunday I was in church, and the priest, he made a sermon and he mentioned euthanasia. You know how the Catholic Church is against euthanasia. And afterwards, I stopped after church to talk with the deacon's wife, and we had a conversation around that. And I was telling her how the church, or the Catholic priests, they don't know what it's like, because I have two parents who are placed in a home, an elder's home, because they're at a point where it's impossible for us, their children, us, to take care of them at the state where they're at. And it's a question that I have, because they ask us, the authorities, to make up our mind about that if the situation comes to that point where we have to make a decision about deciding if we're going to choose euthanasia or not. And I 4 years ago, I attended one of my best friend's mother's euthanasia procedure. She had bone cancer, and she was at the hospital and both her children were living abroad. And she said, I've had a fulfilled life. I don't regret anything. I'm ready to go. And so after the second needle, I saw her jaw drop, and I couldn't stay until the end. It was too much for me. And I went to get the hospital's chaplain. And I knew that he couldn't be there during that time because it's against their principles. But once it was over with, he came inside the room and we said prayer together. And it felt weird to me to invoke death, because that's what it was. We're invoking death instead of letting it come get the person naturally. So I stayed with the ambiguity there. And the conversation that I had with the deacon's wife is, she said, it's God's law that you cannot kill a person. And I said, are you saying that people who commit suicide are being judged by God? You know, like God is love and mercy. He doesn't judge people who choose to die. He and see, the transgression you're talking about, to me, directly refers to that, because it's like a transgression to invoke death and to use euthanasia. And I thought that was a good point when she said it's God law. You cannot do that. But on the other hand, when it comes to the point that there's so much suffering, to see my mother and my father at the point where they're at, what should I do as a Christian?
Right.
Am I supposed to wait that moment of lucidity when their eyes is going to open up and say, Lucy, I love you? You know, that thing that the heart will speak out at the, you know, like ultimate moment, and wait for that.
So I think, yeah, thank you, Lucy. I think I can speak to that, you know, with, I don't know, with clarity, but with relatively briefly. I know that there are different opinions, and I know that there's different ethical questions involved in, you know, everything from do not resuscitate to actively, you know, what they're now calling legally assisted suicide and so forth. So there may be a spectrum of those positions even among those who are here today. And I'll just then speak not with any kind of authority, but with a sense of my own convictions around that, which is to suggest that there's some suffering that is redemptive because it has value in what it might help us to teach us or soften us or open us, or and then there's some suffering that simply has absolutely, apparently, no purpose whatsoever, a terrible suffering that will lead to a brutal and painful death, and with no opportunity to have any kind of redemptive value that's discernible. And I do think that very carefully planned decisions that are made responsibly and with the proper channels could be one of the most merciful things that we could do for those whom we love. And an analogy I've thought of that is rather brutal, but I think might help make the point, is I happened to be in New York City on 9/11. And as you know, one of the most brutal aspects of that day that really sort of got to the hearts of people were what we call the jumpers, those people who, you know, leapt out of a 90-story building because that in that moment was the better choice, which raises all kinds of questions about what horror was happening inside those buildings. And you never hear anyone call those jumpers suicide. You never hear anyone say it was euthanasia. Many of them did jump willingly. Some seem to be pushed out through panic. But many chose that. And in a way, what I think you have in that situation is an acute moment that for somebody, say, who's riddled with cancer and has no chance of survival, is that same decision in an extended way. That the kind of death that confronts me inside this building is so horrific that I'm going to choose this as a quicker, less painful option. And, you know, nobody judges them for that, as they shouldn't, right? Right. So what if we were to prolong that instant moment of an hour or two, where these buildings were, you know, being destroyed from the inside out, and people chose, in some cases, to alleviate that horror, by jumping, then is that really any different than someone who also has no chance of survival, but is confronting just, a painful, prolonged death, to say, there's no redemptive suffering, there's no redemptive value to this suffering, and I'm going to entrust myself to God in a peaceful, dignified way, surrounded by loved ones, etc. So I don't pretend it's not a thorny issue. That shows you where I stand on it, I suppose. I do think it has to be handled responsibly, and I think that the state should not intervene with an individual's choice or conscience around that. But I'm not blind to the fact that it's also a complicated issue, and circumstances could differ from person to person. So I would just put that out there as a point of reflection on, when is some suffering redemptive, and when is it just suffering that leads nowhere ultimately, but the same conclusion? And is it really necessary to put individuals and families through that? It's a legitimate question. I hope that gives you something to think on in that, Lucy.
Yes, it does. I'll bring that up to her and see what she says then.
Oh,
I
okay.
believe that her point of view will be that it's still transgressing God's law.
Yeah, and there's many who still hold that view. Yeah,
Yes, but I told her God, God's love is greater than how does it say in John? God's heart is greater than my heart, or much greater. It's inconceivable. But the other argument is the science also, because as time goes, science will be more capable of helping people to have better cures and all of that. So there's that aspect of the human evolution also that is an argument, I think, that with time people won't suffer so much because science will be able to help them more. It's just a question of time. In the meantime.
So Lucy, I know there's some hands who are waiting to talk. I want to honor that space for them, but thank you for your comments today. Let's see, John, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm in the beginning of the passage. You were mentioning the divisions among us, the tribalism, and how Christianity has meant the breaking down of these divisions. And I'm working with clients right now who are very much struggling with the whole issue of gender, and people who are petitioning this, involved with changing gender, the whole thing. As a licensed therapist, I'm asked to sign letters to assist in changing this, and this is something that I'm really grappling with now much more. I mean, these are like very, very basic divisions in our society, and we're watching what seems to be like a really wholesale change among the young, of their perception of this. And I'm starting to realize this is huge, and this is a really, I think, a really progressive thing, and it's just something that struck me, just reading what you wrote about the kind of the erasing of divisions among us, and this seems to be one that's going on right now.
Yes, John, and it's also creating a lot of divisions, as many of these types of shifts in consciousness do. A year or two ago, I took advantage of the Feast of the Transfiguration to try to speak to this issue, obviously with the play on words and what that might look like. And to be honest, my basic judgment was I don't understand it, and I know that many of my very loving and compassionate congregants don't understand sort of what we might call now broadly gender fluidity. But the point is that not understanding and not judging are two different things. And I certainly have some concerns about what the permanency of these types of gender reassignments might be for somebody who's too young, and should there be some way in giving people a chance to discern a little longer before we rush to a reassignment. There's such a short period of time that we don't know if 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, somebody who's 15 suddenly realizes, well, maybe that's not what I wanted. After all, it was a thing. I don't know. So I have a lot of caution and trepidation around it. but I also know that I really just don't understand it. And so my posture is simply on a one-on-one basis to just be compassionate and to, to trust somebody when they tell me that this is a real experience for them, and not to just be dismissive or lighthearted about that, but to really take seriously their experience. And whether we're just seeing a kind of, what feels to us like an avalanche and a shift of gender identity happening, is that because finally the lid is blown off and people who would never have even had the opportunity to publicly or openly explore this and sort of remained, so to speak, in the closet? Or is there something else at stake here? And I think it's too early, at least for me, to really feel clear about that. But I just know that, reason, caution, compassion, and non-judgment, are the markers for how I sort of approach this as a phenomenon, but also among individuals. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in agreement with what you're saying. I mean, as the guy who's actually being asked to sign letters, supporting somebody's petitions and so forth, I'm in the position where sometimes I agree with a person. I say, no, I think your new identity is very solid. I'm in agreement. I have no problem backing it. I've dealt with other people who they seem to me very young and very confused, and my position in those cases is, I think we should hold off on this.
Well, I think that's very prudent.
I think it is just, you don't have to do this right now, and it's it's interesting just being in the chair where this is the way it comes down, but it's definitely not a one size fits all thing at all, and
No, right.
it isn't I think it would be very irresponsible to just like blindly say, oh yeah, whatever anybody says is cool. I can't do that.
Right. No, and it would be irresponsible, I think, John. I think that's the right approach. You have to really base it on that individual,
yes,
of what and that's what you're being asked to do in your case. So better you than me to make this decision. But I can understand that that's, why that's heavy. But to come to the readings themselves, the question is, is trans identity in the world today the new place where we are easily drawing a division? Are they the new pariah of society, the new scapegoat, the new, and in some levels that may be, and we're hearing and reading a lot about transphobia and what that looks like and so on. So again, there's going to be, I think, decades, generations as we kind of figure this out as a society. We do know that what we're now calling trans identity exists in a lot of native societies and other cultures for millennia and have sort of been integrated in different ways. So there's certainly something to be learned from those cross-cultural lessons that I think Judaism and Christianity have probably tempered to some degree. Western monotheistic traditions have sort of looked askance at that, and that's probably part of the why in Western culture this is feeling new to us, where in cultures that were never Christianized or Judaized or made into more Muslim cultures, those monotheistic traditions had this other way of dealing with this. So who knows what this will look like in a century, right? But we're at the very start of a very confusing time in our social history, I think.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yes.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Carol, please.
So just a quick thing. When I was in high school, a good friend of mine would dress up as a girl and we would all go dancing down in DC. And I look back now and he, I know he would be one of those people that felt that he was a woman. He wasn't, back then the only word we had was transsexual. But, I'm just glad that I was in that phase of my life where I was like, whatever, because, he anyway, I'm like, I appreciate your attitude. I mean, I don't understand either, but I don't have to understand. I just have to love. That's and just accompany these people on their journeys, and But anyway, the reason why I raised my hand was I just love the timeliness of this with the veil. I love this week. Good Friday is everything to me. I mean, Easter's, of course, everything too. But and so I was going back to, and I had a friend that died just this week after 5 years of ovarian cancer. And you would have loved her. She would have fit right into this group. And we had both been in that evangelical group, and we have both taken a similar journey to where we are now, and we just kept saying, it's just love. It's just love. We don't know what it is on the other side. It's just love. That's, and we'll see each other again, and, that kind of thing. But I was wondering about this veil and the thin veil of the Celtics, and how we can practice the presence that, since God so violently, came into the world for us. And, let's face it, birth is violent. I mean, to a woman, it's very violent. And it's violent to the baby. It crushes its lungs to get the fluid out. And, but anyway, I just wonder about the practicing the presence and the acknowledgement. I guess we are doing that in contemplative prayer, but, and it's a twofold question. The fact that God came in and is no longer in the high, that only the high priest can get to. All of us have access to this love. And then the other thing that happened this week, of course, was another mass shooting. And a lot of people said, where's the sovereignty of God? And somebody named Ken Tanner, I don't know if you know this person, but he was posting and saying, he was saying the cross is the sovereignty of God. The cross is God. It's not coming down and preventing suffering from happening to us, or killing off all the evil people, or, what we think we want to God to do. And he was saying, no, God, showed us how to do it with the cross. So we're back to the veil, and like your entire message about the incarnation and how to live, and how God is in us, and we bring about change in the world. Instead of asking God to come in and destroy people, or we're the ones that are bringing Christ into the world through love and breaking down divisions and voting for representatives that get rid of conservative. That's a side thing. Go on.
So, Carol, as we explore these next several pages in our upcoming sessions, I make the point that in addition to this reference to the tearing, the word in Greek is schizo. It's where we get the word like schizophrenic and so forth, right? So it's a very clear word, and it's not taken up by the other evangelists. If you read their versions, the sky isn't torn, it's open, for example, in Luke's gospel. So he has this this moment of tearing of the sky at the moment of Jesus's entry into the public stage, the world stage, at his baptism. And then the tearing of the veil, which, as we'll see, Josephus describes as being a microcosm of the universe itself. So the veil also represents the sky, as the temple represents the cosmos. The whole thing is like a microcosm, macrocosm. So if you can picture what Mark is doing, the very moment that Jesus steps onto the world stage, the Spirit hovers over him, the sky is torn. We have to realize that is in many ways an image of the new creation, the same Spirit that hovered over the water of the ancient abyss, and that God, the first action of God is to essentially to split that water into two to create the upper and lower waters. We have a representation of that same Spirit hovering over the Jordan as this new creation is born. Creation and redemption in the Jewish and ultimately Christian theological world are inseparable. One begins the other, one completes the other. So you have that beautiful image of the Jordan, that ancient Spirit hovering over that primeval water, and the sky tearing. You jump to the very last moment of Jesus's life. He breathed his last as Jesus exits the world stage. That temple representing the sky, that temple veil rather representing the sky, tears just as the sky did at the beginning. So at Jesus's first and last moment, there's this moment of tearing, and of course, where is the presence of God in all of this? Just as the presence of God tears through the heavens, transgresses that boundary between heaven and earth, and is unleashed into the world, so too is the Shekinah, that presence of God believed to sit in a very particular way, to be present in the Holy of Holies, literally busts through, right? Breaks out of the temple, becomes no one people's possession, becomes the possession of all people, if you will, as that spirit is now unleashed into the world. So we're going to look at that dynamic and that parallel, because I really think that that's what is going on in Mark's gospel, and not just me, by the way. There's many scholars who see this. It's a beautiful way of creating what we call an inclusio, an event or word or phrase that's used at the beginning of a text, repeated at the end, in which Mark is saying everything that happens in between these two moments, the first and last moments of Jesus's public life, are to be read in light of these events, meaning that this is the Son of God, right? So we'll explore that more deeply in the following pages, but I think you're right to suggest this, that this is what we're seeing here. Right. So okay. So we'll come back to that. So this is the beginning of that exploration in my book. Thank you. David, please.
Good morning. Will you bring up the last 3 lines of the second reading, having transgressed the boundaries?
Here you go. This one?
Yes. Having transgressed the boundaries between heaven and earth, the sacred and the profane, holiness can never again be set apart from a world now penetrated by the glory of God. That's really a powerful statement. And it means that this extraordinary grace in that moment is for all. And for believers and for non-believers. I struggle a little bit with John 3:16 because it requires belief. And those of us who believe or have been nurtured and believe are very much blessed with that. But a world now penetrated by the glory of God is for all. And how that happens for all, I can't say, but I would argue that even for those who don't believe, that world now penetrated by the glory of God is at work beyond anything that we can ever ask or imagine. And that may be really pushing the envelope, but that's just kind of where I am right now.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, David. So a few weeks ago, I offered a sermon on John 3:16, which attempts to offer an inclusive reading of that text to your concern there about the idea of belief. And one of the things I don't talk about in that so much, but which I think is also true, is when we think about belief in our sort of current context, we think of it as giving intellectual assent to a certain truth. Do you believe this? And so there's like, yes, I affirm that is true as an intellectual proposition, if you want to say, but belief has, I think, not even also, but even more implied in the pistes or pistos in Greek, is more a commitment to, rather than an intellectual consent about something, if that makes sense to you. So there's a way, and we often also confuse when it says, I have come. He says, I have come not to judge the world, right? Or rather, not to condemn the world. One of the things that we often confuse is judgment and condemnation, and sometimes Jesus uses the term judgment, which is krine, and we assume condemnation, and it isn't condemnation. Judgment, you can judge between, do you want a chocolate ice cream cone or vanilla? And if you choose chocolate, which of course you would, why would anybody not? But if you choose chocolate, that's not condemning vanilla. You're just making a discerning choice, right, between the two. But we typically hear the word judgment in the mouth of Jesus or the Bible and assume that means condemnation. Nowhere in that text is condemnation or certainly eternal damnation implied in the word krine. So there's a lot we could unpack linguistically and theologically, and also see seeing that text in the broader context or thrust of the gospel, like other texts which says God wills the salvation of all. And as many theologians have raised, the question, well, if God wills the salvation of all and doesn't accomplish that, then God has failed, which is impossible, and then God isn't God. So you can take all of these texts out of their context and line them up and ask, well, are we looking at universal salvation, or are we looking at, the salvation among the few? The question then that has to be raised is that, knowing what we know about, the history of our planet and civilization, we know for a fact that the vast, vast, vast majority of people ever to have lived and ever will live will not be Christian, right? So the question then becomes, are we to assume that God would have created the majority of creation to be condemned and suffer eternally forever? Why just never create them at all? Why would God create a species, right? And where the vast majority are destined to suffer eternal hellfire? That seems just unimaginably cruel and sadistic from everything that we know about God in both Testaments, certainly in the Gospels. When one could just ask, well, if I were God and that was going to be the fate of these people, just don't create them. Why do that? So there's a lot that we could ask around who gets saved, if you will. But I think the larger trajectory of the gospel and of Christian tradition really, in my opinion, insists that that the gospel requires us ultimately to a place of universal salvation, full stop. And I honestly don't know how to read it otherwise, because there's so many theological problems that creep in about the cruelty of God, about the powerlessness of God, about the triumph of sin over God's mercy. I mean, there's a lot of theological thorny things. And when you examine the proposition, is there universal salvation or not, what you find is that there seems to be some agenda, usually around a kind of religious rigidity or scrupulosity, that those who decide against universal salvation are clinging to or are grappling with. Whereas one has to, for example, just ask this: how psychologically plausible is it that a mother who is a Christian has a child who turns away from the faith for whatever reason, legitimate, illegitimate, doesn't matter, right? Goes to heaven. This is what I was saying in my sermon. Imagine her being in heaven, all right, knowing that her child who rejected Christianity is suffering for eternity in hell by that same God that she is in rapture with. I mean, I don't even know where to begin with what the implications of that are. If that mother loves her child enough, certainly she would be interiorly tortured by the idea that the thing she loved most in life is suffering eternal hellfire and separation from God. How could heaven be heaven for her? Forget her kid for the moment, right? How could it be heaven for her is the question. What do you do with that? And so the stinginess of our need to be right and therefore have the vast majority of humanity suffering so that I could feel right about my commitment to Christ seems just profoundly spiritually immature and deeply problematic on a theological level. And I think Christianity needs to boldly proclaim, not tepidly, universal salvation. And more books are indeed coming out. I just read one by an Orthodox priest that was profoundly beautiful around this question. And, we can go all the way back to Origen, who talks about the empty hell theory and basically uses this analogy: the first will be last and the last will be first. Well, if Satan is not a demigod, but is really just one creature among many, and was the first to fall, then he will be the last to be saved. And then will all of history and salvation have been made whole, right? He's just an angel. He's a creature like all of us. And yes, he is the arch enemy and so forth and so on. But as a creature, if his salvation remains impossible, there is a statement there that says some faction of evil remains greater than God's capacity to forgive. So as Origen says, at the end, hell will be empty. Satan will see the error of his ways in such loneliness and isolation, will reach for salvation, and it will be granted. Now, the church condemned him for this, wrongly, in my opinion, and I think we need to rehabilitate some version of what he's talking about, because again, not because then what's implied is there is something incomplete or lacking in God's capacity to love infinitely, without end, and for God's love to ultimately reign over all, no exceptions. The moment you have an exception, the implication is that God is incapable of doing something, and now you have a God who is impotent. So there's so many ways in which this can be looked at. But again, I think we'll see over the next several decades a lot more exploration of this and its implications and how to look at that. So then, of course, people say, then why be Christian? Because it's the most beautiful way you could ever live your life, because you're already living in the kingdom now, because you don't wait until that future moment, that this is the church becomes, the Christian community becomes that presence of the kingdom on earth, that leaven kneaded into the bread, growing and growing and growing. So it's a privilege and a joy, not an obligation in order for you to have a secure exit strategy. It's the joy to live in heaven now, as what is it? Catherine of Siena, all the way to heaven is heaven because Christ is the way. This is it. So come on in. We'll all get there eventually, but we've got this joy to experience even now. That's why. Not to save yourself from some fear of hell, but to live in the kingdom as it's broken in, as it's torn through in history, and now invites us into that. I hope that helps, David, but I want to affirm your.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Richard, please. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's so good to be in the company of people who so sincerely look non-dogmatically inside, starting with Peter, who broke me open, reminding us that in our brokenness, in a tearing, and that we are transfigured into a different state in this moment. As soon as he said it, I realized that I was again coming from a position, a fixed position, and as God tears me, I have to drop my self-righteous position. I've been grumbling over Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, attacking Disney for their so-called woke welcoming. Disney World in Florida no longer welcomes boys and girls by gender welcoming, but now says welcome all dreamers. And DeSantis is using that as a hate campaign to run for president. And I'm on his case, and I have no sympathy for someone who may actually be pained by being confused about the plethora of trans gender identities that are occurring, some very successfully for people. And my point, I think, is that as I misidentify myself with my position, I lose all other possibilities that God, this instant, is creating a brand new world, both according to metaphysics and physics and quantum. And in this brand new moment, I can not know who I am. And in that not knowing, I am free to be any new possibility and to not make enemies as one possible choice. So that's thank you, Peter, for reminding me of the essential brokenness.
Thank you, Richard. Beautiful reflection. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, thank you for one of the most wonderful discussions I've ever heard. I wish everybody in the world could share with us.
Thank you.
But Tim, I have a teeny tiny question too. Could you share with us the name of the book by the Orthodox priest?
Yes, if you'll pardon me from walking away for a moment, let me grab it off the shelf. So there's one actually of all people by Hans Urs von Balthasar, who some of you may know is actually a rather, and I don't say this in a pejorative sense, is a very conservative Roman Catholic theologian who happens to be one of my favorite because he understands beauty and he understands the tradition. But he wrote a book called Dare We Hope That All Shall Be Saved. And what he says is that we can't affirm that without some question, but really is just trying to, I think, as I read through this, he's just trying not to get himself into hot water with the authorities, but is clearly pointing that, yes, we can hope and yes, we should hope. But so that book, it's very, very affirming. And again, from somebody who's a real traditionalist in the tradition. So he knows the tradition well, he works with it well. And he really draws this conclusion, like it's kind of untenable to draw it otherwise. Alvin Kimmel is the priest I was referring to. Actually, he was originally an Episcopal priest and he converted to the Orthodox Church. And his book is called Destined for Joy. And the subtitle, The Gospel of Universal Salvation. A rather thick book compared to just give you an idea, it's how many pages we got in here. It's about a little over 400 pages. And so a very well vetted, and even though it's long, it's not a hard read. It's actually a very accessible read. So those would be two. And there's another one that came out that we have in our library here that I can't recall the title of, that is also, very recent and really appeals to the illogic of an eternal hell within the logic of Christian theology. He says just like as an illogical conclusion to draw from everything else we can draw out of the Christian tradition. So those, and if I think of it, I'll try to send that to Joanne for our next class so that you can all have access to that as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy reading. Enjoy. They're very beautiful books. Yeah. Let's see. Judy, please. And Judy, you are unmuted.
Maybe she walked away.
Yeah, I think I just saw her try to come back in. She might be having trouble. So Sylvia, let me jump to you and then we'll see if we can come to Judy after.
Okay, I'm so glad I got in. My alarm didn't go off and I kept trying starting around 7:10, but the room was locked, but now I'm in. So thank you. And thank you, Joanne, for helping. Well, I'm following along, and this is an amazing discussion and just a brief little story that some people have heard before. I was 9 when I was kicked out of Sunday school because we were being taught eternal damnation, and I had an African girl, 9 years old, as my pen pal who had never heard of Jesus. And I was burned on my hand, not horribly, but it was extremely painful. And I was trying to imagine her being covered, her entire body, with burns, which my hand was so in pain over, and that she would have this for the rest of eternity. And I actually challenged the Sunday school teacher. And then she was very upset with me because I was describing the pain my little pen pal would be in. And she brought in the priest. And he was arguing with me that, yes, she would be burning like this forever. And I asked him, how could that be? And what kind of love is that? And I just kept asking him. And then finally I said, well, why are you here? And he said, what do you mean? I said, why aren't you in Africa? Why are you here? We already know about Jesus. Why aren't you where everyone hasn't heard about him yet? And why are you even here? How can you live with yourself? And they kicked me out. So anyway, they asked my parents not to bring me anymore. So that precipitated 25 years of Buddhism and Sufism and shamanic studies and then non-dual. And it was 6 years ago that I found my way to St. Columba's. And so I was thinking this morning, how was all that for me? And I'm glad my camera's not on because I'm probably going to cry. It helped me explore all these other paths and see the innate beauty and divinity in everything. And I didn't find my way back to Jesus, to you, to our beloved community for years and years and years. But on the way, I found that every molecule of earth is God, and every molecule of every being has the essence of the infinite creator at its heart. And we are never outside of the sacred heart of God, not for a moment. And when you've said over and over again, Father Vincent, always and already, we are already and always saved. We are already and always welcomed. And we are creating new life on this evolutionary journey home. So that was how it was for me.
Thank you, Sylvia. On the one hand, very sorry for that experience. Happy for the journey it led you on, and glad that you found your way home again. So it's very beautiful all around. Yeah, thank you. And just also in response, I wanted to, resonate with the story you told. Mike Santori just put up a link, which is indeed the other book I had in mind. So thank you, Michael, for that. That's the one that's in our library. And you can see that link there, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation by David Bentley Hart. It's an eminently readable book. And I would also recommend that one. I think that's the text where I read where he starts by like talking about how long a trillion times 10 to the 8th power trillion is, and then says that's just the first day in eternity, right? So he just starts to say, like, on what level is it plausible that in a mere 80 years, which is nothing at all, that we could do something so horrible that it would deserve that kind of suffering forever and ever and ever. And so when you begin to really look at the question of eternity, and even the fact that it's, to come back to your point, Sylvia, that it's defined as fire is sort of a medieval invention, because of course people were looking for the worst possible way. So there's nothing even within the tradition that requires us to think of hell as being burned. The lake of fire of Gehenna in Revelation, you're not burning forever. You actually are annihilated completely. You just stop existing. It's a very different reality. But nevertheless, of course, that's how the medievals get hell associated with fire. There have been other ways of trying to describe that, isolation, loneliness, disconnection from God, whatever, future longing that's never satiated, and so on. But yeah, your intuition, even as a little girl, out of the mouth of babes, like when you start to ask people about the ones they love, the ones we love, and that love becomes your hermeneutical lens for asking questions about eternal suffering, you get a very different approach to that. And if our love, pale as it is in comparison to God's, finds that intolerable, how could we believe that of God's infinite love? It really starts to just unravel quite quickly. And there always seems to be an ulterior agenda, usually born of some kind of spiritual anxiety, self-righteousness, whatever, that is really the energy behind we're the in crowd, everybody else is the out. I feel safe because I know that I'm in the one small little remnant that will enjoy heaven forever. So skirted that, and that becomes sort of this self-preservation rather than something that's more expansively grounded in love. And unfortunately, that has infiltrated Christian traditions all over. Right? Judy, please. Good to see you. I think you got knocked out of the thing for a bit. There you go.
Thank you, Father Vincent. This has been absolutely beautiful this morning. It reminds me that I believe that faith is a gift from God given to me. And so many times I think we try to make faith a head thing, how we perceive it in our head, how we can understand it in our head, but we can't. It's something that we have to feel. It's something that we grapple with in our hearts. And for me, when we start the conversations that are just hell bent out there, you know, this is my opinion, this is the way it is, this is what it should be. That's all a head thing. That's not that's not who God is for me. And it's a heart thing. And you know, Jesus told us to have faith like a child. A child isn't going to have those kind of thoughts, those kind of deep theological thinking thoughts. A child is going to love from, like Sylvia, and not at 9 years old, is going to love from her heart. And thank you. Today's been beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And let me just speak to something more as a point of interest, because without it negating anything you just said, because I agree with you. When we look at the innocence of a child or the way that they love and so forth, there's something profoundly beautiful about that. And you are absolutely correct to talk about, you know, it's that simplicity of loving than all of the theological sort of fun that I might have in my head around these questions. It really boils down to loving. And this, of course, is something that the Desert Mothers and Fathers said about interpreting the text, which I talk about earlier in the book. Their basic point is to interpret the text is to live it, to embody it. And until you've embodied it, you haven't interpreted it. So it isn't, you don't go to commentaries to interpret the text. You go to your heart, you live it. You know, you want to know what it means to love your enemy. Well, love your enemy. Now you've interpreted that text. Now it's real. So all that aside, an interesting point of fact is that teknon, which is the Greek word for child, when we hear that word, we, as I think your comments sort of speak to, we think of innocence. But in the context in which Jesus was talking, it's more, teknon really implied dependence rather than innocence, so that he wasn't so much making a comment, not that, and again, it doesn't negate your comment, but he wasn't so much making a comment that it's about the heart, not the head. He was saying it's about a child is one who is utterly and totally dependent on their family, particularly their parents. So we are to depend on God the way a child depends on their mother and father. That's the implication. Now, I say that more because we've sort of picked that up in sort of cultural analysis of these texts and how they came out. But just think about how that adds to the meaning of that text when we talk about the childhood first and foremost representing a dependency. What does it mean for us to really give ourselves over to God in that loving, heartful way? So I just say that as a matter of interest. But thank you, Judy, for your comments. Very, very beautifully said. Nora, please. There you go.
Okay. Father, I loved Sylvia's beautiful, well, it's been a beautiful morning of discussion. But Sylvia's sharing was so special, as it often is. And I'm particularly struck by the idea of God, her saying, of God in every molecule. And I think it's my net is that it's always been that way, I guess. And so I'm struggling with the idea of the tearing, the symbol of tearing, and God breaking into the world in the incarnation of Christ. Do you understand what I mean? I mean, I have the feeling that I have the sense that God has always, the glory of God has always been and
Right.
always will be. The incarnation is really in my net, I guess. Is Christ breaking into us to show us the way, not so much into the world, but into us.
Right.
I don't know. Does that make
So
sense?
yeah, it does make sense, and I'll try to summarize. In various parts of the book, I think I try to. So in a sense, if I'm hearing it right, the question is there a before and after that's meaningful? If we talk about the incarnation, did it change anything, or is there anything that hasn't always been anyway that we would speak about the incarnation as such? To try to just frame it in the quickest way possible. I read once that that God has certainly always existed alongside creation, has always been the source of creation, has always existed with creation. What the incarnation affirms is that God exists as creation, and that marks a certain distinction. It in a way completes the way in which God has always been present, but in a way that, if you pardon the expression, it consummates it, right? Unites it physically, so that there is now a physical union of natures between flesh that we share with all animals, all living things on some level, and the divine. So in many ways, it's a process. I love the medieval Kabbalistic notion that the rabbis talked about of Tzimtzum, which is this act of withdrawal. The first act of creation is an act of withdrawal because God had to create a space that was not God in order to create the beloved, that is the object, or even if you want to say subject of God's love. But then what we might say in Christianity is that withdrawal in which the whole cosmos comes into being isn't complete until God pours the divine self back in as creation. This is what Teilhard de Chardin calls the Christification of the universe, in which God exists not with, alongside, or as the source of, but as creation. And there Christians would mark the distinction, so that the fundamental mode of revelation is no longer a book or a particular piece of real estate or location, a holy land, or even a symbol. It is a human heart. That this is the fundamental place of God's revelation in history through a human being, the heart of Christ, and by extension, the hearts ultimately of all of us. So that would be sort of one way, in a very brief sense, and there's many different ways we could look at that I think Christianity wants to insist on a before and after, in order to really help understand the radical, nature of what we mean by incarnation, right? And the reason that I'm calling it, as I do often in the book, a scandal, is because to both Jews and Gentiles, as Paul says at the time, the idea that God would be anything but transcendent, that God could be touched by death or suffering or all the weaknesses and limitations of a human being, this was a radical scandal. So, when Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we preach Christ and Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Judeans, right, and a folly to the Gentiles, by which he means the Greek philosophers. He's saying all these images of God maintain a kind of boundary, an insurpassable boundary that is defined by God's ultimate, utter, and unreplaceable transcendence. This is inviolable. God's transcendence is universal and inviolable. So to suggest that transcendent God, for whom, especially in Israel, you have God, you have a thick, impenetrable line, and then you have everything else. To suggest that God now crossed that line, tore through the sky, tore out of that veil, is scandalous, and was scandalous. It's so much so that even early Christians like the Gnostics and the Marcionites, and even the Jewish Christian adoptionists, could not accept what Christian orthodoxy ultimately insisted on, which was the full union between the material universe and the divine, human and divine, right, in Christ. And that is the scandal of Christianity. That is the tearing that I'm trying to talk about here, because it is scandalous. It is a transgression that neither the Platonists in Greek society, where you had your world of forms that were perfect, and everything we do here is just trying to kind of grasp at that, but never quite gets it, or the transcendence of Yahweh or the Shekinah, all becomes now completely wedded. Remember, Jesus is not an avatar. He doesn't appear as a human being, as we see like in Hinduism, where you have various representations who come and go in the appearance of human flesh. He lives a full human life from the moment of conception to the moment of death. everything about Jesus is human. It's not a facade. It's not a phantom. It's not a hologram. It's not an avatar. It's a human being. So the insistence there is that that the human face of Christ becomes not a veil that hides Christ, but the very mechanism through which Christ is revealed, right? Through flesh. That is what Christianity wants to insist upon, to the scandal of basically everybody else, to be honest. That's really a tough leap to make. But do you see the difference? So your intuition is right, Nora. We can't say that God was absent, clearly. I mean, our stories of creation will clearly demonstrate that, which is why in so many of our gospels, as I just described, the baptismal scene or Jesus, the prologue in John's gospel, all harken back to creation imagery, because Christianity is saying there is a new creation here, something new, or creation is being now finally completed through this consummate relationship between the divine and the material world, between God and humanity, between flesh and spirit, that is now inseparable. And it's why, for example, when we pray in the Eucharist, before consecrating the wine, mixing the water and wine, that is the mixing of divinity and humanity. You pour that water in that wine, you could never extract it again. It's impossible to take those molecules out, right? So by the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. Deification, it's right there in the middle of the Mass, symbolized by the inseparable nature of these two liquids that are now forever joined. That's the difference.
Thank you.
That makes sense?
Helps. Yes.
Good.
It very much helps. The idea of consummation.
Yeah, right.
As consummation. Yes.
And honestly, I know that there's a certain strand of prudishness in Christianity that wants to kind of avoid, frankly, sexual imagery around mysticism, although many of our mystics pretty much, draw on quite erotic imagery. I mean, the Song of Songs is one of the most mystically commented upon texts in the Bible, and it's all around conjugal, imagery and so forth. But I don't think we should be shy of that, because in our experience as human beings, when we are truly, deeply in love with someone, just sitting together in a movie theater doesn't cut it. Like you just really want to be one in every imaginable way with this. So the idea that God is so deeply in love with his beloved, with her beloved, as to refuse to stop shy of that conjugal union, that radical joining, is, to me, I'll put it as blatantly as I can. If Christ isn't who Christianity says he is, then I may as well be an atheist, because to me, that is the only God of love. Any God who stops shy of that union is still holding back, if you want to say. That is not love, right? Love by its nature is diffusive, and perfect love is perfectly diffusive. So if God is perfect love, that diffusiveness, that sharing, the gift of that cannot stop until it is completely united. And we see that unfold in cosmic, evolutionary, and human history. And so, John Edwards, what's his name, Australian theologian, says that the incarnation is, spiritually speaking, the pinnacle of evolution, because not only does God enter into the human and material reality of the universe, but the universe also perfectly receives the divine in an unalterable way that can never be extracted. That's some beautiful stuff to think about.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And that's for everyone too, again, not just the ones that believe in it.
Sure, and we have to insist it's not even for merely humans, and this is, again, not some newfangled ecological sort of, if you go back earlier in my book, we see, who was it? Was it Athanasius, who basically says, who would be so stupid to not be able to see that Christ has clothed himself with the universe? I think he uses the word paltry-minded. Who would be so paltry-minded that you couldn't look at the universe and see that God has clothed himself with the universe? I mean, so these are, it's going back to 3rd, 4th century Christianity. And of course, there's places where we see that unfold. So we might say it more gently today than he did, but the idea is, who could not look at creation and see, as Teilhard de Chardin would say, a universe that is utterly, thoroughly shot through with the divine, Christified, right, through and through. it's again, it's hard not to ultimately come to that conclusion, right? If you're really reading the Gospels correctly. Right? So thank you, Nora. So Marian, we'll take your question last. I'm aware we've gotten, the time is flying. So go right ahead.
Thank you. Amazing theological discussion. Thank you for that teaching. Probably this is not an easy answer, but all what you were saying about universal salvation brings up to me that a question of, are you saying there is no hell, or Satan, or so what do we do with that when we kind of see some of the saints and some mystics have said they have seen hell? And I think of the way I think of God is completely universal love, but we have the choice of whether we respond to that love. And I guess that's what I have thought up to this point of that we will at the end of our life. To me, my life has been hopefully a continually opening to that love. And when I die, I will completely, be in that love. But it's, so I think of anybody, if there is a hell, anybody that's in there has chosen not to be with God in love.
Right. So it's a very good question. I like Thomas Merton in his, again, New Seeds of Contemplation. It's a beautiful imagery where he basically tries to demonstrate that very point, which is to suggest that, so there's a couple things we have to unpack, reframe, and then assert, I think. So first of all, we want to move away from the idea that heaven and hell are places, are locations, for example, that we want to not spatialize them. I think that's fine to do that in a less mature spirituality. But I think when we speak of heaven and hell as spaces or places, we also run into a whole host of problems. Like take, for example, the ascension. If heaven is a place that you could go to, then the ascension really marks the absence of Jesus. He goes away to some other place. But if the language is metaphorical, he is now seated at the right hand of the Father, to use the New Testament text. Well, where is the Father? Where is God? God isn't away or out there. God is everywhere. So the ascension is the transformation of a discrete Jesus who lives here and now in this place, walking in this time, limited by all the space-time continuum, to use a modern idea, to one who is universally and perpetually available, full stop, right? So the inbreaking of the kingdom in a very discrete way, by which I mean a particular way, you could point to Jesus and say, he's there, now he's there, now he's back there. All of that becomes a universal presence through the ascension, right? And then ultimately the release of his spirit, or the spirit, through what we now call Pentecost. These are ways in which we try to celebrate mysteries that transcend our capacity to really understand. So the ascension isn't Jesus going anywhere, it's Jesus going everywhere. So I say that because that helps us to move beyond the spatialization of heaven and hell as is there a place where somebody is currently now dwelling? And I want to try to help us look beyond that limited point of view. What Merton says then is to suggest that we are like the wax of a seal that, say, a king or queen would use to stamp a document. And when we die, or as we live in beyond the veil, the idea is that God wants to he's drawing from Revelation, impress the name of God on us, which is to give us the full imprint, right, of God's being. Well, if through love and compassion, that wax is warm, when that seal of God comes down, it will receive that, and we will have the capacity to receive that because we're supple and warm and so forth. But then he says, if through selfishness and egoism and so forth and lack of compassion, we die and that wax is hardened, the very same act of God doesn't change. God intends to impress that name on us, that image, but we're incapable of receiving it. So the very act of God that's meant to be our salvation it shatters us under the weight of it, right? We can't receive it. We crumble under the weight of that act. What he's trying to suggest in that analogy is that damnation doesn't come from God. It comes from the choices we make to embrace or not. Here, I think the vision of purgatory, again, not as a place, but as a noun, or I'm sorry, as a verb, purgation, something that begins now and continues into what we would call afterlife, or continues beyond the veil, if you prefer. That purgation begins now. We are all learning to love. We are all a little bit of sheep and a little bit of goat, right? We're trying to be more sheep than goat and so on. And so how do we learn to love and so forth. But I would also suggest, and I don't think Merton would disagree, that that we don't have to necessarily mark the boundary of salvation on the moment of death. I think that is again a very stingy theology that suggests that somehow after death that purgation cannot or even does not continue, right? When we talk then about hell, it's more of a state of relationships, a state of being, just the way the kingdom of God has no particular geography or circumference. Its center is the center of every human heart. That's the center of the kingdom. The kingdom really defines a manner of being in relationship with God than a territory. And so hell, I think, is the same. It is a manner of being out of relationship with God on some level, and therefore in itself a perpetual source of suffering, because the isolation from God is itself a kind of punishment, if you will. The invitation, I think, can and must remain open to that individual. The question is, at what point does that individual have the capacity to begin to soften, to receive that, to repent, and whatever word you want to give for that. And so both the reframing these spiritual states as states rather than places, and understanding in a sense that the condemnation comes more from our no rather than God's judgment. And so then that opens the capacity for God to continue to woo us both in this life and the next until we find that love, that mercy, that compassion ultimately irresistible. That would be, in a brief sense, how I might try to frame that.
Thank you. That fits my understanding. Thank you.
You're welcome, Marian. All righty. Thank you. Great questions, all of you today. Thank you so much. I do want to call up for us very briefly the slide again for us here so that we can look at our practice and discuss if anybody wanted to have any practices for us here. All right. So let's see. So my challenge for the coming session: write a prayer about holy transgression and share with the group the next time we meet. So write a prayer about what holy transgression means to you, and then perhaps if you feel up to it, you can share that with us. And Marianne, did your hand go back up, or did it just never go down? Are you?
I'm sorry, it never went down. I'll put it down.
Okay, no problem. I didn't know if you were asking something. Okay, so then if we look then at last session, reflect in your own life where religion, that should be has served as a security blanket and where it has served as a catalyst to love. Do these exist side by side or feel opposed to one another? So where in your own life now, I'm not talking theoretically, has religion served both as a security blanket, right, or a catalyst? And have you seen that side by side? Anybody give that some thought and wanted to discuss that before we close out today? All right, we'll keep thinking about it. Let me also then make an announcement. So as you all know, a week from today, we will be in the midst of the holiest days of our year. I will be not only leading a retreat on the Mysterium Pascal, the mystery of Easter, where we'll be exploring through my sermons a number of the theology of the liturgy and what the church looks like through that theology. But I'll also be leading a retreat. And we happen this year, blessedly, to have quite a large number of folks coming for that retreat. So it's going to be an exciting time. But that will make it very much impossible for me to be here with you for Holy Saturday. So we'll meet again the following week, so 2 weeks from today, because I'll be both frantically still probably writing my sermons and also trying to lead a retreat and practices and so forth. So I do want to wish you all a very, very blessed Holy Week. And I invite you to, in your own tradition, to allow yourselves to really open up to both the sort of cosmic divine drama that this week ushers into our lives, all the challenges that it poses, both interiorly but also socially, globally, all the beauty and the hope that it offers, and all the honesty that it presents about the reality of death and suffering and the ultimate salvation and the ultimate victory of Christ and of love. So to just allow yourselves the gift of really moving into the sacredness of these days ahead, and that they may deeply transform your heart and your life and and deepen your relationship with Christ. So as we go into this most holiest of all weeks, I send you my blessing. I abide with you in the silence of your prayer, and I invoke the Spirit of Christ to descend upon you into your hearts, to transgress all the boundaries that you have erected within yourself, to break them down, and to help you release the grip you have on whatever nets you still hold, that you may truly know that transformative love of Christ in your own heart and in your lives. And so I say, go with my blessing in the name of the Three in One and One in Three. Amen.